October 1943, Papua New Guinea. At 5 a.m. over the sea, the 9th Fighter Squadron tangled with a swarm of Japanese Zeros. The P-40s fought a long, brutal duel, diving through clouds, rolling out of tracer fire, pulling into tight climbing turns, then striking again from above. After 20 minutes of twisting combat, 5 Japanese fighters finally fell from the sky. But on the long flight home, fuel ran dry. One P-40 fell into the sea. Another crashed in the jungle. Their real enemy wasn't Japan, but empty tanks. Corporal Mark Mac Delaney, 24 years old, Brooklyn accent, hands like vices. He wasn't just a mechanic in 9th Fighter Squadron. He was a combat mechanic. One of those grease-stained magicians who kept tired planes alive on airstrips carved out of jungle and coral. Mac had seen enough wrecks. Out over the sea, pilots could fight brilliantly, outturn a Zero, shoot an Oscar into the waves, and then, as they banked for home, the engine would sputter. The fuel was gone. They'd won the dogfight and lost to physics, gliding helplessly into the Pacific, while the rest of the squadron counted another name off the roster. He'd tried all the proper things. New cork packing when he could scrounge it. Safety wire on the quadrant screws. Nothing worked. One afternoon, he pulled a bent paperclip from his pocket, the kind you'd find holding forms in an office, not fixing warplanes. He twisted it into a tight U shape and slid it over the valve's face so one end pressed against the lever. It was a spring, nothing more, but it locked the control in place. No movement, no rattle, no leak. He tried it on Lieutenant Eddie Sloan's Warhawk, Nancy J. Sloan had already dead-sticked once into kunai grass after running dry mid-fight. Mac showed him the new click under the lever and said, "That click is your gas staying yours." The next morning, Sloan flew a long patrol toward Cape Nelson. When Zeros appeared, he stayed and fought. Twice he checked the fuel gauge, expecting it to sink, but it barely moved. 3 hours later, he came back over the mountains with fuel still in the tank. Enough to land safely. Enough to live. When Mac crawled under the fuselage afterward, there was no sharp smell of evaporated gas, no blue streak across the belly. The fix had worked. He grinned one of those rare, tired grins men give when they've beaten the war for a day. By nightfall, 6 P-40s had paperclips hidden under their floorboards. By week's end, more than 20. No memos, no orders, just combat mechanics quietly turning office scraps into survival. And thanks to one paperclip and one stubborn man, those P-40s finally had what their pilots had been fighting for all along: the range to win the battle and come home. October 26, 1943. The morning mist burned off Dobodura's runways by 0900, leaving a haze that smelled of oil, salt, and wet grass. The 49th Fighter Group had already lost 3 P-40s that week, not to enemy fire, but to silence. Engines coughing dry, props windmilling over the jungle. They'd flown too far, chased too long, and run out of fuel within sight of home. Rescue teams brought 2 pilots back. The third never came out of the trees. Corporal Mark Mac Delaney stood in front of a field map with a stick of chalk in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He drew 2 circles, one showing how far the P-40 could fly, in theory, and another smaller, tighter, showing what the pilots actually managed. "Fuel loss," he muttered, tapping the board. "Half a gallon an hour, maybe more. You can't fix that with better flying. You fix it where it leaks." The officers didn't want to hear it. The Curtiss maintenance manual said the valve tolerances were fine. The field inspector said evaporation losses were normal in tropical conditions. One captain even told Mac to stop inventing excuses for bad planning. Mac didn't argue. He just kept bending paperclips. By the second week, results were undeniable. Pilots who used the Delaney fix, though nobody called it that, officially landed with 5 to 8 gallons more fuel on average than unmodified aircraft. In combat terms, that was 10 extra minutes in the sky. 10 minutes was the difference between turning for home or finishing the job. The first real test came on October 30th, a coastal sweep over the Dampier Strait. 12 P-40 seconds from the 9th and 7th Squadrons launched at 0700 to escort A-20 Havocs hitting Japanese barges at Gasmata. The mission plan assumed zero combat, just cover and home. The Japanese disagreed. 6 Key 43 Oscars rose from Rabaul and caught the formation south of Cape Gloucester. They attacked head-on. Classic Imperial Army style, high, frontal, flashing into the sun. The A-20 seconds dived for the deck. The P-40 seconds turned to meet them. Lieutenant Sloan was there again, flying Nancy J. His fuel board said he'd have to break off after 2 minutes of fighting to make it home. He'd already been warned twice about staying too long on station. But this time, when the first Oscar slashed past and he rolled into pursuit, he didn't look at the gauge. He trusted the clip. The fight lasted 11 minutes. Sloan downed one Oscar with a short burst, damaged another, and still climbed back to altitude with 20 gallons left. 4 other pilots in clip-equipped planes returned with fuel to spare. 2 without the modification had to ditch near Finchhaven when their tanks went dry halfway home. That afternoon, the squadron operations officer, Major Claiborne, came to the line personally. "All right," he said, squatting beside Mac's workbench. "What the hell are you doing to my airplanes?" Mac didn't look up from the piece of wire in his pliers. "Keeping the gas where you put it, sir." He demonstrated the clip-bent steel, dog-eared spring, 8-second install. Claiborne stared. "You're telling me this thing," he flicked the clip with a finger, "is saving fuel?" "Not fuel, sir. Pilots." By dusk, Claiborne had ordered every flight crew chief in the 49th to copy the modification. They raided the supply shed for office clips, safety pins, anything springy. Within a day, the base clerk complained that nobody could file reports because all the paper clips were gone. The mechanics grinned. The improvement showed up immediately. Sortie radius expanded by 20 miles. Aircraft that used to return at fumes now landed with a margin. Ground crews started calling the paperclip spring Angel's Hand. Pilots said it felt like someone had given them back their courage. The Japanese didn't notice at first. They only saw that the Americans were lingering longer over targets, pressing attacks instead of running. On November 3rd, radar at Rabaul tracked a formation of P-40 seconds, circling for nearly 20 minutes after their bombers left. That had never happened before. Fuel was always the Allied weakness. Not anymore. At Dobadura, Mac worked through the night. Sleeves rolled up, sweat cutting streaks through grime. He kept a small pile of bent clips in an empty tobacco tin marked spares. Every plane that carried one came home heavier, safer. The mechanics started joking that Mac wasn't maintaining airplanes anymore, he was buying time. Nobody knew it yet, but those minutes were about to turn into something bigger. The next week, the Japanese would throw their best A6M0s from 201st Kokutai into the fight over the Huon Gulf. It would be the first time the 49th's P-40 seconds could stay long enough to fight on equal terms. The paperclip hack had done something absurd. It had changed the geometry of the sky. November 5th, 1943. Dawn over Dobadura. The jungle mist still clung to the runway as ground crews fueled the P-40 seconds for a long-range escort to the north coast lie to Finchhaven. Then, out over the sea. The mission radius was 360 miles, the farthest the Warhawks had ever gone from home base without a refueling stop. Before the paperclip fix, that kind of range was suicide. Now, pilots called it the new normal. Mac Delaney didn't believe in miracles, just mechanics. He crouched under the wing of Nancy J., checked the valve lever under the floorboard, and ran his thumb over the paperclip detent he'd installed 2 weeks earlier. Still tight, still biting. "You'll come home full enough to land," he told the airplane, like it could hear him. At 0720 hours, 18 P-40 seconds lifted off into blue sky. 6 carried drop tanks. 12 didn't. They didn't need them anymore. Mac watched them go, wiping oil off his hands with the same rag he'd used for 2 days straight. He'd learned to count the seconds between takeoff and climb out. That was how long he held his breath before letting himself believe they might come back. The Japanese spotted them over the Victories Strait. Radar at WWII picked up the formation heading northeast and scrambled Zeros from 251st Kokutai. 15 fighters, seasoned pilots, veterans of Rabaul. The intercept happened over the sea, near Umboy Island. Open water, no landmarks, no chance of ditching and surviving. The Zeros came in high and sunward, classic tactic. The American leader, Captain Claiborne, called a defensive turn. It should have been the moment to break off, save fuel, stay alive. But this time, the P-40s didn't peel away. They stayed. Sloan saw the first Zero dive through the formation. He broke to follow. Throttle firewalled, Allison roaring. The fight was on. For 12 minutes, the sky became chaos. Zeros cut tight loops, light and sharp. P-40s used weight and dive, slashing through, climbing again. Usually, the Americans would disengage after 2 passes. This time, they didn't have to. Their tanks still read plenty. Sloan's voice crackled over the radio. "Still green. Staying in it." The phrase spread through the squadron net. Still green, the signal that meant they weren't running dry. They fought like men untethered from the clock. Lieutenant Orr from the 7th Squadron flamed a Zero that tried to climb into the sun, his 50 seconds ripping through the tail. Lieutenant Reeves rolled inverted under another, staying with it through a turn that should have bled him empty. 2 P-40s were hit, but stayed flying. After 20 minutes, the Zeros broke off. They'd run low themselves. The Americans stayed, circling the wreckage, covering their own. When the P-40s finally crossed the Owen Stanleys at 1030, every pilot still had fuel to spare. Nancy J. landed with 12 gallons in reserve, almost unheard of for a combat mission of that range. Not a single plane had gone down to starvation. Claiborne met Mac on the line that afternoon. "You just bought us the damn sky," he said quietly. "Those boys stayed because they could. We've never had that before." Mac shrugged. "It's a clip, sir. A clip. And 5 minutes." By evening, the field buzzed with word of the engagement. 23 confirmed kills, no losses. The first time in the New Guinea campaign that P-40s had decisively beaten Zeros in open-air combat. The pilot said it wasn't just luck, it was endurance. They could stay in the fight long enough for training, teamwork, and firepower to matter. The mechanical advantage had shifted. The Japanese noticed too. Intelligence summaries from Rabaul reported, "American aircraft persist over target area beyond usual time, fuel endurance unusually long." They assumed new tanks, better engines, maybe even hidden airstrips. They never guessed the truth. An ounce of bent wire under a pilot's heel. That night, as rain drummed on tin roofs and the jungle steamed, Mac sat on an empty fuel drum outside the hangar. He stared at the tin of spare paperclips in his hand, each one a tiny life insurance policy. Every plane that carried one came home with a few more gallons, a few more seconds of chance. He didn't see invention or genius. He saw one stubborn mechanic refusing to accept, within spec, as good enough. In the mess tent, pilots toasted the clip. Sloan said he'd never flown with more confidence. "You don't realize how much fear burns fuel," he joked. Nobody laughed. They all knew it was true. Less fear meant smoother hands, cleaner flying, fewer mistakes. The paperclip hadn't just saved gas, it had steadied nerves. Back at the hangar, Mac dropped another handful of clips into the tobacco tin, labeled it with a piece of tape. For flight. He'd learned one truth that day. Sometimes, the difference between retreat and victory isn't horsepower, armor, or speed. It's a bit of spring steel holding faith against vibration. And in the skies over New Guinea, that absurd little spring was rewriting the math of survival. November 12th, 1943. The rainy season had started early. Sheets of water turned WWII's taxiways into mirrors, and the air smelled of mud, avgas, and rot. The Japanese had begun raiding the base nightly with twin-engine Bettys from Rabaul, more harassment than destruction, but enough to keep every man jumpy. Pilots slept in their flight gear. Mechanics slept under tarps beside their aircraft, ready to patch holes before dawn. Corporal Mark "Mac" Delaney hadn't slept in 2 days. He sat cross-legged under the wing of Nancy J., polishing the control quadrant with an oily rag. The paperclip spring he'd fitted weeks ago was still there, blackened with grime but holding perfectly. He had no replacements left. He'd bent every clip in the admin tent into detents. The clerk complained his files were held together with safety pins now. Nobody cared. That morning, the 49th Fighter Group got new orders, an extended escort mission for B-25 Mitchells, striking Kavieng, 600 miles round trip. Even with the paperclip fix, that distance pushed the limits. The B-25 seconds would have to fly heavy with bombs and light on fuel. The P-40 seconds would go light on ammo and prey. In the briefing tent, Major Claiborne told them flat, "You run out of gas out there, you're done. No landfall, no rescue." Then he looked over at Mac, who stood in the back, coveralls soaked. "Unless our miracle mechanic here has figured out how to make a Warhawk sip kerosene." The men laughed, but not entirely as a joke. They trusted him now more than they trusted Curtis. At 0610 hours, the formation roared down the strip and climbed into a bruised sky. Mac stood in the rain, counting them out. 17 fighters, 4 bombers, nothing between them and Rabaul, but 6 hours of fuel and faith in bent wire. 2 hours later, the fight came to them. Over the Bismarck Sea, near Long Island, radar on the Mitchells lit up with blips. 24 Zeros from the 204th Kokutai screamed in from the north. They'd been waiting. The P-40 seconds met them head-on. Usually, an engagement that far from home ended with 1 or 2 quick passes and a retreat fuel margins too thin for dogfighting. Not this time. Captain Claiborne ordered, "Stay tight, protect the bombers." It was a death sentence under old rules. Now, the gauges stayed green. The Zeros dove through the escort screen. Sloan rolled hard left, his P-40 groaning. His gauge flickered, but the needle barely moved. The clip held. He climbed, rolled over, came down behind one of the attackers. A burst of .50 caliber tore the Zero's canopy off in glittering fragments. Sloan called it out, one confirmed, and dove again. For 23 minutes, the fight churned across 20 miles of sea. The Mitchells dropped their loads on Kavieng and turned south. The P-40 seconds followed, bloodied but still flying. Fuel was low, but not desperate. They'd fought and still had the legs to make it home. Back at WWII, rain still hammered the field when the first planes returned. Nancy J. taxied in at 14:17 hours, shot up but breathing. Sloan climbed down, eyes hollow, uniform drenched in sweat. "We stayed with them the whole way," he said quietly to Mac. "All the way." Out of 17 Warhawks, 14 returned. None ran out of gas. 2 crash-landed on the strip with bullet-hold tanks that had been full an hour before. The B-25 crews brought news. Japanese radio chatter called the American fighters persistent devils. They were convinced the Allies had installed new self-sealing tanks or hidden drop tanks under the wings. That night, when the rain eased, Mac sat in the maintenance bay, his back against a crate of ammunition, his hands shaking from fatigue. Sergeant Ruiz dropped beside him and handed him a cup of tepid coffee. "You know," Ruiz said, "they're saying your clips turned this whole outfit around. Pilots are calling them Delaney Springs." Mac stared into the cup. "They're paperclips, Hal. That's office junk. Don't make it something it ain't." Ruiz smiled. "Office junk that just got us home." Word spread beyond Dobodura. Mechanics at Nadzab, Gusap, and Finchhafen started copying the modification from sketches passed by courier. Some used bits of safety wire or phonograph needles. Others tore steel bristles from brushes. Anything that could flex and bite. Within a week, an entire wing's worth of Warhawks flew with Mac's absurd fix. Japanese pilots began noticing that the P-40s weren't peeling away early anymore. Their intelligence officers blamed American auxiliary tanks, or engine improvements. They didn't understand the real improvement wasn't in the airframes, it was in the courage to stay. By mid-November, the 5th Air Force had logged its first sustained long-range missions without refueling losses. More pilots returned, more sorties completed, less fuel wasted on the ground, less fear in the air. In the maintenance logs, nobody wrote paperclip. They wrote valve detent, reinforcement installed per field modification. No credit, no names. Just a number FM4943 and a check mark beside it. That night, as rain turned to mist, Mac walked the line with a flashlight, touching each Warhawk's belly as if counting children in their beds. The hangar smelled of gasoline and wet earth. Somewhere out beyond the dark, Zeros were taking off from WWII, flying toward the front. They'd never know that their fate, somewhere above the sea, would depend on a piece of spring steel no bigger than a cigarette. War changes fast, but sometimes it changes quietly, one clip at a time. November 19th, 1943. The heat came back. The rain stopped, and with it, the mud turned to dust so fine it clung to everything: fuel hoses, skin, engine cowlings. The P-40s of the 49th Fighter Group sat lined up like beaten dogs, their paint burned dull by tropical sun. In the maintenance tent, Corporal Mark "Mac" Delaney hunched over a valve assembly from a wrecked Warhawk, studying the lever that had started it all. The edges were worn smooth from thousands of vibrations. He flicked it with his thumb. It rattled loosely. The same sound he'd heard for months, the sound of wasted fuel. But the squadrons were flying farther than ever now. The brass had noticed. Reports from the field showed missions that should have ended short were returning with gallons to spare. Extended endurance due to improved field maintenance, one report said. Nobody mentioned paperclips. By now, every crew chief at Dobodura carried a pocketful of them. Some bent theirs in secret, others proudly in the open. The supply office had stopped asking why thousands of clips vanished every week. Mac's crude innovation had gone viral, passed by word of mouth, pencil sketches, or just a nod toward the valve housing, and a wink. And the Japanese were feeling it. Intercept records from Rabaul showed longer engagements, deeper escort penetrations. They called the P-40s Shisen Oni line demons for the way they refused to peel away. They'd adapted their tactics, deploying pairs of Zeros to harass, hoping to force the Americans into fuel panic. It didn't work anymore. The panic was gone. November 21st. The biggest test yet. A combined Allied strike on WWII, over 700 miles round trip. The 8th and 9th Fighter Squadrons would fly escort for B-24 Liberators bombing the airfields there. The planners calculated the margin. 1 minute of fighting time, then home or die. Mac overheard it in the ops tent and muttered, "Not anymore." He and Sergeant Ruiz went to work through the night, crawling through the cockpits of every P-40 on the line, checking that each lever snapped clean into place. 40 aircraft, 40 paperclips, 40 promises. Ruiz joked, "Hell, Mac, you're arming these birds with office supplies." Mac grinned, wiped sweat from his face. "Then let's make paperwork kill 'em." At 0600 hours, the formation thundered off the strip, the air already shimmering with heat. The Liberators droned north. The P-40s climbed above them like hunting dogs. Over the Bismarck Sea, they met resistance dozens of Zeros and Oscars from 248th and 78th Sentai. High-altitude chaos followed. Lieutenant Sloan dove first, firing short bursts, climbing again to cover the bombers. The Zeros chased, quick and nimble, but the P-40s didn't break off. They stayed, curving wide and slow, then re-engaging. The bombers reached WWII intact, dropped their loads, turned for home. The escort followed, still fueled, still deadly. The battle lasted nearly 30 minutes. The liberators took hits, but no losses. 7 Zeros fell. 2 P-40s limped home, leaking oil but burning strong. When the formation returned to WWII, the pilots were stunned. They'd flown farther, fought longer, and still landed without running dry. Sloan found Mac beside the runway, grease-stained and exhausted. "Whatever you did," Sloan said, "we just rewrote the limits of the map." Mac only smiled. "Nah, just stop the leaks." That night, over black coffee in the mess, Major Claiborne broke the unspoken rule. He raised his mug and said, "To Corporal Delaney, the man who made the sky bigger." The pilots cheered. Someone joked they should pin a medal to a paperclip. Mac laughed, embarrassed, and went back to the line before dawn, because the work never stopped. But far to the north, the Japanese were already rewriting their reports. Commanders at Rabaul warned of increased American fuel capacity. Mechanics inspected wrecked P-40s, baffled by full tanks still intact after crash landings. They couldn't explain it. They assumed a new tank design. No one thought to look under the cockpit floor for a bent bit of wire. 2 weeks later, the 5th Air Force's kill ratio improved by 20%. Pilots credited better tactics. Commanders credited morale. Only the crew chiefs knew the truth. It was a spring made from scrap, holding faith against vibration. By early December, the modification had a name in the field manuals. Field Mod 40D Fuel Selector Retainer, improvised. The supply sergeant requisitioned spring clips, general purpose, by the thousands. Every warhawk in New Guinea carried one, though nobody outside the island knew it. In the still air of that December night, Max sat outside the hangar, a single clip between his fingers. He turned it over, studying the tiny bend that had changed a war. "You know," he muttered to Ruiz, "back home this'd be holding papers together."